Because we're having a work party today, I was asked to keep things short. So I'm giving you a short talk. I had to cut out some stuff. I had to cut out my love of comic books. Things like that, but other than that. In the book Perla, Carolina de Robitus has a wonderful passage on the truth-telling power of reading. Words seep right into your mind. They pour into your secret hollows and take their shape, a perfect fit like water. And you are slightly less alone in the universe because you have been witnessed, because you have been filled, because someone once found words for things within you that you couldn't name. Something gesturing not only toward what you are, but what you could become. In that sense, books raise you in a way your parents can't. They emancipate you. If I get one thing out of a book, an interesting fact, a point of view I hadn't considered, something helpful to my life, or just entertainment, then the time and money I spend with books is worth it. I also am never bored, because I always have a book with me. So when I have to stand in line or sit in a doctor's office or even go to a football game, I read. I got a lot of booze for that. I remember being an excellent reader in the early elementary school years. I was often asked to read aloud to my classmates. In later elementary grades, I was given the privilege of leaving my class during a certain time to read what was called in those days the crippled children's classroom, while their teacher worked with selected students who needed her specialized help. My parents were very supportive of reading. In fact, if I was reading, I didn't have to do anything in the house. Always a good excuse. Mother took her 3 girls to the library on Saturdays to check out books. My dad had a membership in the Literary Guild. We had the World Encyclopedia. We read the daily newspaper. Sunday after church, which was a day of rest, we read books the rest of the day. Well, most of the day. At 5 o'clock, we turned the radio on and listened to The Shadow and the Green Lantern while eating popcorn for supper. At first, I read books for young readers, like the Bobbsey twins. But in the olden days, kids read books that are considered classics today and that adults don't think children are old enough to read them. So by the end of 6th grade, I had read Great Expectations and The Christmas Story by Charles Dickens, the Mary Poppins books, the Albert Terhune books about animals, almost all Bible stories, Little Women and the rest of the series, Little Men, Joe's Boys, etc. Most of the books by Jules Verne, Alice in Wonderland, Robinson Crusoe, Treasure Island, Heidi, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. You get the idea. C.S. Eliot said, "No book is really worth reading at the age of 10, which is not equally and often far more worth reading at the age of 50. What we read when we are young is what stays with us forever." As I grew in years of maturity, I managed to knock off my dad's novels from the Literary Guild, very adult stuff, and moved on into my generation's books. I loved books on a grand scale like Gone with the Wind, which I read 8 times before I was 30, and Forever Amber, which was the dirty book of my generation. I also read that one 8 times. It developed my love of historical novels and led to a major in history in college. It covered King Charles II's reign in England during the bubonic plague and the London fire. Plus, it was a great romance. This book was never even considered a classic, but it sure was exciting. I loved Green Dolphin Street by Elizabeth Gouge. This book had vivid, exciting tales of earthquakes, shipwreck, encounters between New Zealand settlers and the indigenous Maori people. This novel takes characters on dramatic adventures from childhood through an old age on land and at sea, and from the Channel Islands to China to the New Zealand frontier. I've never really read for high-minded reasons, except for literature classes in high school and college. I read for emotional and intellectual excitement. I read to learn about other cultures, other people, to experience other people's experiences, to learn about places and adventures I would never experience myself. So I'm a vicarious reader. The years I worked at the Hackley Public Library in Muskegon, Michigan between ages 14 to 19 was a place to feed my reading hobby. I would find an author I liked, and then I would read everything they wrote. I read everything by Victor Hugo, Anya Seton, Frank Yerby, for example. I managed to read a lot of nonfiction while I worked in the reference room. It was part of my job to keep the books in Dewey Decimal order. So I read a lot of philosophy, travel and adventure, religion, and literary criticism in those days and evenings when things were slow, especially on Friday nights. Nonfiction books that had a large impact on me were probably ones you've never heard of these days and are all out of print. The first one was Man and His Gods by Homer Smith. I read this at probably about the age of 14 and pretty much stopped my church going. This is a history of religion. He understands and explains philosophy, biology, archaeology, and the history of science and the scientific method. He starts with the evolution of developing civilization. He details how tribes started cultures rich in myth and ceremony. I learned that man creates his own gods. Other books that influenced me were Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell and the lectures of Robert Ingersoll, which I gave a previous sermon on. A book like Black Like Me, this book and the Ingersoll books led to my rejection of dogma of any sort. The book, Black Like Me by John Howard Griffin, gave me a better understanding of the race issue, and In the Silent Language by Edward Hall. I don't have some of those books anymore. But this one was extremely interesting to me. I learned to appreciate the nonverbal language of other cultures, especially in regards to space and time. For example, when we greet in the United States, we shake hands, which is about the space that we want between ourselves and somebody else. In the Mideast, they like to get close, so they usually hug or do the cheek-to-cheek kind of thing. And when they talk to you, they tend to stand too close, and sometimes you can feel their spit on you, which is very uncomfortable to Americans. But in Japan, they bow, which gives an even greater space because they're so heavily populated, they don't like the crowded feeling. And then last but not least, I could go on forever about books that I read, but I won't bore you with all that. Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a more recent book, The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond. This is a thorough study of the rise and fall of societies based on geography, disease, and the use of metals for tools and war. I had the privilege of hearing him, too, because he was at Mott Middle College for one of the Ballinger lectures a few years back. Right now I'm reading The Seventh Sense, which I would recommend to everybody. It's scary as all get out, by Joshua Cooper Ramo. This book is about power, fortune, and survival in the age of networks based on technology and connections, and how close we are to artificial intelligence. In summary, I would like to say that reading is my religion. As daily motivations go, Carpe Diem is an admirable one, but I prefer Carpe Librum. Seize the book! This is where I satisfy my curiosity and develop my own philosophy about life and its meaning. In reading fiction, I see the world from other people's points of view, which are an essential precondition for a moral philosophy based on sympathy and empathy. Books can cause a revolution in thought, as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring did. That book launched the modern environment movement by challenging the prevailing scientific consensus about pesticides. Once upon a time, women were discouraged from reading by men who feared their doing so would breed rebellion and dissatisfaction. Sure enough. This was also why slaves were not allowed to learn to read. Reading leads to thinking, which in many cases leads to action. Jerry Seinfeld said, "A bookstore is one of the pieces of physical evidence we have that people are still thinking." A final thought about the importance of reading is that recent studies by Yale University with a 12-year follow-up shows that book readers experienced a 20% reduction in risk of mortality over non-book readers. Unfortunately, the Yale researchers said longevity was not increased by reading newspapers. So my advice is that if you haven't been reading books, you really should start right now.